Hello, my name is Joshua Bowen, and this is an introduction to the Synoptic Gospels, where I hope to give an overview of what the Gospels look like, what are the Synoptic Gospels, what does the word synoptic even mean, and where does the book of John fit in all of this? So to begin, I really think we need to start out with the Gospels themselves. Now we have 4 books in the New Testament that actually start the New Testament, and those are considered the Gospels. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. Gospel being good news, they refer to the life of Jesus while he was here on earth. His acts and the things that he did with his disciples, the people that he led, and the miracles that he performed. Hence the word gospel. Jesus is the good news. And we have these 4 books. And each of these gospels are distinct in their own way because they were written by different people and most likely at different times. We have Matthew to start it out. His primary purpose when he wrote his gospel was to tie the Old Covenant to the New Covenant, or the Old Testament to the New Testament. He does a lot of quoting from Old Testament law to show that Jesus is who he says he is. And then we have Mark. The book of Mark was written as a testimony about Jesus. It was written by a follower of Peter and written most likely by listening to the stories of Peter as well as the other disciples that had gathered around. Now Luke was writing down the beginning of the church, early church history if you will. So the book of Luke is actually a 2-parter, with the Gospel of Luke being first and then the book of Acts being second. And then we have the book of John. Now John was written by one of Jesus' disciples, and his purpose of his book was very much to prove the deity of Jesus, that God became human flesh. 3 of these books are really similar in nature. That would be Matthew, Mark, and Luke. And these 3 books, when you're looked at all together, you notice that many things in these books line up nearly 1-to-1. And that's actually where we get the word synoptic. Synoptic actually means seen together. And when you see these 3 books together, you see these many similarities between them. And that's where some scholars call it the synoptic problem. They're asking themselves, why are these books so similar to each other? Was there some conspiracy in the early church to tell a story of Jesus? Some legend of their own to prove this new religion called Christianity? Or does it go deeper than that? Well, as scholars have looked throughout the histories at these 3 books, at these Synoptic Gospels, they realized that these books were not necessarily a propaganda tactic by the early church to prove that Jesus was God. Instead, they were written by 3 different people using similar source material. Now that begs the question, which one of these books were written first? And based off of what we can see when we look at these books together, most scholars believe that it was the book of Mark that was written first. As a matter of fact, if you just look at the quick math, we can see that the book of Mark, it shows up more in the other 2 books than the other 2 books show up in each other or even in the book of Mark. There's some correlation there, but not a lot. But when we look at it, nearly 97% of the book of Mark can be found in the Gospel of Matthew. Likewise, 88% of it can be found in the book of Luke. So it stands to reason that Mark must have come first. In truth, though, there's enough similarities between these books that one could argue that something may have even predated the book of Mark. So some speculate that there may have been another one, not a gospel itself, but another collection of writings or oral tradition that we now call Q. And that Q is where we may have derived these 3 books from. And the similarities in these books is why we call them the Synoptic Gospels. It's why so many people study them so earnestly, because they are so similar in the way that they write. Now with that said, where does that bring us with the book of John? Do we throw away the book of John? Well, no. The book of John is in the Bible for its own reason and its own purpose. And as I said, each of these books were written in their own tone and in their own way. And John is very different from the other 3. Well, John had his own point. And as I said before, he really wanted to show the deity of Christ. He started off with a very different perspective, where the Gospels themselves, the Synoptic Gospels themselves, as Fred Zuspel once said, they show that this Jesus we're talking about is God. They still talked about him being deity. Then they started with Jesus is God. Whereas John took it from another approach and said, this God became Jesus. And because of that, we can see that it is a very different tone, very different scope and purpose. We also know that John was very close to Jesus in his writings, and that also shows up in some of the tonality in there. Definitely putting in a good word for himself in foot races among some of the other disciples. So that's it. That's the Synoptic Gospels in the Bible: Matthew, Mark, and Luke. The books that are seen together because of their similarities. And just because John is a little different, we don't discredit John. John doesn't have to be exactly like the others for it to fit, because it's written from a different perspective, a different purpose in mind. Thank you so much for joining me today for the introduction to the Synoptic Gospels. May you be blessed.